there's enough overlap between Hermetic thinking and Christian thinking that at the end of the day, Christianity, as it achieved hegemony in Egypt, in the brief period that it achieved hegemony in Egypt before the rise of Islam, clearly a link between Hermes and Thoth pretty early on in the syncretistic world of Alexandria. Metal objects we've all seen in museums, that requires a high level of technical skill to generate metal like that. The Greek theoretical mind and the practical Egyptian metallurgical mind meet. And they meet in examples of people like Zosimos of Panopolis or Cleopatra of Alexandria or Maria the Jewess. And it's in that crucible, alchemy emerges and becomes associated with Thoth Hermes. Death and rebirth are the same thing, and we get the image of the famous Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its own tail. The alchemist certainly had a vision of the world in which, because everything was one, hentopan, right? Everything can be dissolved back into that one, and from that one, anything can be created. So I think that there's a pistis road, which one, but there's a Gnostic road too. Somehow you get secret knowledge about the nature of reality. That this reality is somehow fundamentally fake, and that a real reality is now revealed to you, that you know about it, and that knowledge of that real reality allows you to discount focusing on this world, elevate your pneuma, elevate your spirit, and then eventually leave this world upon death.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And here from popular demand, you guys have been asking for him, and I got a hold of him, Dr. Justin Sledge, Esoterica, one of my favorites as well, Ph.D. of philosophy at University of Memphis. Your channel speaks for itself. You have knowledge that is like beyond 99% of people when it comes to these subjects. And it's just so vast variety of things. Plato, the Gnostics, Judaism, all this stuff. You just get into all of it. And it's really, I'm so thankful to have a channel like yours around that I can go to and learn from, you know?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. It's really a pleasure to be on and chat with you. And yeah, it's a lot of fun to make the content I make. I'm sometimes feel really blessed that I have advanced degrees in Western esotericism and not advanced degrees in, I don't know, chemistry, because now I get to talk about magic and alchemy and the occult and
Yeah.
whatever, the Rephaim, which is what I'm working on for this week's episode. So yeah, a whole smorgasbord of weird things. So I'm really happy to be able to work on that stuff, and it's really a lot of fun.
So I got to ask you, how did you get into all this stuff? Did you have some sort of understanding before you got your education, or is it all from education?
So so I think that the main things that really got me into this stuff were just growing up on a pretty steady diet of Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious Worlds and In Search of from like the 1970s with the great like synth, everything's spooky, and Jack the Ripper and magic and alchemy and stuff, for the Bermuda Triangle for whatever reason. And so I just really, from a young age, I was just absolutely. This is like before the History Channel was just like weird stuff. It was it was before it was like whatever. And so yeah, it was before that it was even history. And so I just really love these. It went from the History Channel to the Hitler Channel to like Ancient Aliens in like 10 years.
So
There's a weird arc to the History Channel.
yeah.
Like the Discovery Channel, it's mostly about motorcycles at some point. Yeah, everything got really weird.
Who knows?
So I really was raised on that stuff, and like my local library had a copy of the Time Life books about all the unexplained ESP and aliens and that stuff. And for whatever reason, it just struck a nerve with me that the world was a lot more mysterious than I thought maybe normie people realized. And I was sort of walking around, my whatever 10-year-old self being like, there's aliens and Bermuda Triangle and Loch Ness Monster and ghosts. And so the world that I could have lived in as a child was was a really enchanted world. And as I grew older, I got a lot more skeptical of those kinds of things, but I never got disinterested in them. And so what ends up happening is that the skepticism and the interest continued to work together, as opposed to the skepticism being like, oh, that's all nonsense and we shouldn't study it. Nor did it say, oh, I'm going to believe in all this stuff, and just take it all whole hog. There was a dialogue between the skepticism and the interest, and eventually that found its home in the academy. And I finished a degree, an undergrad in religious studies and philosophy, and I was like, you know what I really want to do is I kind of want to really dive into this in a deep way. And so I traveled to Amsterdam, which is was at that time one of the few places, and is now really the only place that offers advanced academic degrees in the study of esotericism.
Oh,
So
wow.
you can you can get a PhD in the occult, basically.
Wow.
And so it's a really great opportunity. The Ritman Library is there, which is now the Embassy of the Free Mind is what they've retooled themselves as, which is a really great institution in Amsterdam. I'm going to be back there actually this summer, and
Wow.
so I deep dove into that stuff and really studied. I studied my ass off. I think I was in the library probably 8 hours a day most days,
Wow.
and just working and working and working, and really enjoyed it. And got out of the academy and thought, what do I want to do? And I was like, let me make a YouTube channel. My brother had been like, pushing me. He was like, hey man, I think that this would work. And Jonathan is wiser than I am on this stuff, and it's my brother. And eventually, I was like, all right. I sort of pitched the idea of Esoterica to a couple of people, and they thought, I think this will work. And I'm really blessed to say that it's doing well, and
Yeah.
folks seem to really appreciate the content, and I really love working on it. So it's really a blessing in that regard.
How long did it take for it to start taking off? Was it were you just making videos for a while that nobody was watching, or did you just right away start seeing growth?
It's a good question. I think for the first maybe 6 months, it was a pretty slow gain, and then a couple of videos got picked up by the algorithm, and God knows
That's what happens.
the gods of the algorithm. I think there's you can to know the secret Christ of the Gnostics is one thing, but to know the inner life of the algorithm, that's true Gnosis.
That's true. No,
That's true. That's the real occult knowledge. So a couple of things got picked up by the algorithm, and I started having conversations and really getting into community with people, having conversations like this, and um, yeah, it took off. And the channel just turned two this month. Actually, it turned two this month.
yeah, I
So
saw that. I saw the video. Yep.
yeah, so it's been a lot of fun, and yeah, the channel's doing well. And I think that there's a real thirst on the part of people for um, people want access to knowledge about topics in esotericism, which you're doing really great work with that, is interviewing scholars and doing that work, which is really really cool. But people want access to this material, but they want access that's reliable. They
Right.
want scholarly, academic, and they don't want skeptics who are just like there to be jackasses and make fun of people. And oh, you're interested in old magic and old alchemy, that's all old outdated nonsense. That kind of attitude just doesn't fly far with a lot of people. And so I think people want a healthy dose of skepticism, a healthy dose of real information, but also try to have fun with it. Like,
Yeah.
this stuff is weird. Let it be weird. Let it be fun.
Right.
We can respect the material and not take ourselves too seriously, I guess. So I think that maybe that combination of things is part of the reason why the channel's doing well. I mean, it's not my good lucks, I'll tell you that. Uh, so but so I guess it's those things that are helping the channel do well. But I really feel thankful for that success.
Yeah, that was well put, and I think you are exactly right. People want the experts who are specialized with the PhDs, and I'm thankful to be able to sort of be like in the middle where I can get them on and ask them questions, give my own, opinions, but also make sure I check with the people who are special. Dr. Dennis McDonald had a good an analogy about this. He said you're like a fox. It's like you're not grounded, but you'll go everywhere. You'll check everything out. You're eating all of the garbage and everything. He said, but he's us scholars. We're like groundhogs. We're grounded, and we're in our area. We
Mhm,
stay in our area. But we go deeper than you. We can go all the way down to the bottom, and you don't even know that's there.
mhm.
It's like, that's a really well way to put it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting analogy. I just also like the idea that scholars can really have their head up their ass. Just like I think that they can really be sort of in their own little world. And I think that by having conversations with people who are deeply interested but not trained in the academy, the conversation is just so much more rich.
Right.
And I think one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, is that when scholars look down their nose at the internet and look down their nose at YouTube and look down their nose at people who are genuinely trying to learn outside of the bounds of the academy, what ends up happening is when scholars do that, they create a vacuum, and that vacuum lets crazy in. And so what you get is crazy, like bizarre stuff, conspiracy theories and Atlantis and racism and all kinds of bad stuff.
Right.
And so I think that it's really important for scholars of every kind who can sit down with wonderful folks like you and other folks who are working on, that can have these conversations. That needs to be happening a lot more in our society, because it's for me it's a sacred duty that I have, that I've had the blessing in my life to get access to this information. So I have a sacred duty and an obligation to get it out there and to get it to the folks who want to have access to it. So that's really important from my side of things.
Absolutely. So let's get into some of the gnosis right now.
Hmm.
So I don't know, where do you want to start with? I wanted to ask you what you how you see Gnosticism. What do you define it as? Because I know there's some people who think that it's not even a thing.
Right.
Some people think that, oh, it is a thing. It's Demiurge and Sophia. What do you see? When you talk about Gnosticism, how do you define it?
Yeah, this is the big perennial problem since the Williams book came out several years ago, that basically said that we need to blow this concept up, and that it's not really helpful. Um, or another way of putting it is that there's at least as much internal diversity among Gnostics as there would be sideways to other Orthodox Christians. And I think that that's true. I tend to agree with Williams that I think that the category, when used not rigorously, can lead to all kinds of confusions. So I tend to think of Gnosticism primarily along two basic axes. When I use the term, and I try to use it sparingly, when I use the term, I typically use it to mean two things. One is I typically use it to indicate what I would call demiurgic traditions. And those demiurgic traditions could be found in paganism, they could be found in Christianity, they can be found in Judaism. They can be found in a whole realm of what I of late classical, second, third centuries, maybe a little early, a little later, mythologies about creation. And that demiurgic character is that somehow our creation is a mistake. It was a mistake, and that demiurge, rather than the proper divine being, created it. And there's every flavor of that story, right? The Valentinians have a flavor of that story. The Sethians have a flavor of that story. Um, the Hermeticists have a flavor of that story, although there it's not a mistake. Actually, it's not a mistake. It's actually the world is a kind of god. You see it in Plato. And even in Christianity, with the Logos doing the creating, there's a kind of non-fatherly being doing the creating.
Right.
So it's what I would call, that's the first axis, is the demiurgical traditions. Um, so that's the first. The second is that it has to do with the soteriology of what we would call Gnosticism. Soteriology is one of these $4 words that has to do with how you get saved.
Right.
And so there were lots of competing theories in the time around the second, third centuries about basically how to get your life fixed. And there was a range of them, from Stoicism and Epicureanism, which were on the philosophical side about how to live a life that was the best life, all the way to the more spiritual side of the Hermeticists, the Gnostics, Christians, Jews, whatever. Um, and the question there is, what is the mechanism by which salvation is achieved? And even in early Christianity, there's a big active debate about what's doing the salvific work. Is it the execution of Jesus? Is it Jesus went into hell as a kind of ransom, and he kind of ramboed the whole situation, where he like snuck into hell and then got everybody out, then like double crossed the devil, which I still think needs to be like at least a movie. So there's this ransom theory of salvation. There's the atonement theory of salvation. And so the question is, what on the part of the believer is required to merit that salvation? And it seems like early on in Christianity, and even in the writings of Paul, there's a kind of division. And the division is what I would call the pistis gnosis division. That on the one hand, there is a kind of faith, trust in what has happened, the execution and resurrection of Jesus, that achieves that salvation, that one believes in it, trusts in it. And pistis is better translated as trust than faith, I think. Um, in fact, I think when you translate it as trust and not faith, you get a whole different vision about how to read a lot of those texts, which I think is a really important valence for that.
Wow.
Because faith has all kinds of weird connotations of believing things irrationally, as
Right.
opposed to trusting something, which is a very different. But pistis means in many ways the same thing in Greek.
Wow.
Um,
Good point.
so I think that there's a pistis road, which won the pistis, or the pistis road won. But there's a Gnostic road too that you also see in Paul in some of his epistles. That it's about knowledge, and it's the knowing that I think is important about the Gnostic movements. And so it's that somehow you get secret knowledge about how to about the nature of reality. That this reality is somehow fundamentally fake, and that a real reality is now revealed to you, that you know about it, and that knowledge of that real reality allows you to discount focusing on this world, to elevate your pneuma, to elevate your spirit, and then eventually leave this world upon death. So to me, there's a kind of axis here. There's a demiurgical axis and there's the Gnosis axis. And to me it's about where various groups fall on that axis. Not that there is a thing called Gnosticism that you're either in or out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, do you think that Plato's demiurge, do you think that influenced the Gnostics, or do you think this is totally separate?
No, I think it had to have influenced them. No, the real big question is not. I think there's definitely influence there. The technical term is there. The craftsperson who made the universe. I think that the big question is, when did it become malevolent? And that it's a
Right.
transition to that being going from being a good being the way that it is in Plato. The demiurge is a kind of,
Perfect.
yeah, it's a perfect being, and it creates things the best that it can given the materials that it has. It's just that our world's imperfect because matter is just by its nature imperfect. It's not evil. Plato never goes down the road to say that matter is evil, and neither does Plotinus for that matter. It's getting close to bad. Non-being is bad, and it's the closest thing to non-being, but it's not inherently evil. The Gnostics really roll that all the way over and say, no, it's actually bad. Um, and this is the enduring mystery about where did that move happen, because we don't see it. We don't see a transition, which is really interesting. We don't see a moment where Plato is saying, no, reality is imperfect, but still not evil. And then the Stoics think that that physical reality is totally fine. The Epicureans think it's totally fine. There's no real evidence in the Gospels or in the New Testament that matter is really bad. There's some valences that it's not perfect, right? That it's a temptation and things like that, but not inherently evil. And I think in the way that perhaps some of the Gnostics viewed the
Marcion.
physical reality as a kind of prison,
Yeah.
and that the whole process was a prison break out of this reality. Um, and what's especially curious about it, and David Litva has done some great work on this as well, is that the transition is weird because it seems like people who made the transition to reality being a kind of cosmic mistake, probably were Jews who knew about the Jewish creation stories in the Hebrew Bible, and for whatever reason went renegade and then made the God that did the creating work evil. And there's something really fascinating about that that's, I think, at this point probably lost to history, that we'll never really quite figure out exactly how that transition happened. Um, Unless the sands of Egypt might still give up their secrets, but
It's true. Well, I
so
mean,
we should.
when you look at Marcion, and I think he brings up parts in the Old Testament that he says, "Look, a loving God wouldn't do this, so therefore that has to be a evil." I
For
wonder,
sure.
do we see that attitude before Marcion, or is you think he's just sort of the beginning of this movement?
I mean, we see it a little bit we see it in Marcion. We'll see it later in Celsus. Celsus will make similar kinds of arguments, although his book is lost, so we don't know exactly the arguments. But it seems like Marcion's maybe one of the earliest to make those kinds of movements. I mean, the Romans and the Greeks had their own beefs with Judaism, but it was never because of the capriciousness or seeming evil of Yahweh, because their gods were also jackasses. I mean, it's like,
Zeus.
yeah,
Zeus
yeah,
is right.
Zeus is is a bad actor. So it's not like you'd be like, your god drowned a bunch of people. Like, your god's a rapist. Like,
Right. Yeah.
right? Like, are you really gonna? It's pot and kettle at that point.
Right.
Um, but there's something about Marcion's, I think, real innovation that really rolls that over. Um, but I think those demiurgical traditions existed prior to Marcion. So, for instance, we see them; they're very maturely developed all the way by the time of Valentinus, and so that tradition's there. Now, Valentinus doesn't make such a big deal about the malevolence of the demiurge in the same way that some Sethian texts, like the Apocryphon of John, will. The Testament of the Gospel of Truth isn't just not that big of a deal in the same way that later in the Apocryphon of John it might be. But yeah, I mean, it's an easy argument to make. You get a God who creates everything, then kind of drowns everybody and stuff. It can be read as a very capricious God. Um, and of course, that's going to line up with Christianity, because Christianity, a big part of early Christianity, is going to be who gets to decide, what's literal, what's metaphors, and the you can't simply read the flood story as simply God killing everybody. It's more complicated than that, and things like that.
Right.
So, but yeah, I think Marcion's a key player in that moment. But I think that he's, what's the right way of putting it? He's a key player in a kind of intellectual movement that's already fermenting.
Right.
I think he's not. I think he's one player among several that must have been emerging at that time. Somewhere in Alexandria, I think, is when that revolution took place. Because again, it seems fully formed really by the second century, and
Oh,
there are fully formed and competing theories of it.
yeah.
That's another thing that people have to really understand about Gnosticism. There's not one theory. The Sethian theory and the Valentinian theory are not the same mythological structures. The Valentinian system is very syzygy based, whereas the system in the Sethians is not. Um, and even in the Nag Hammadi library, we see different groups beefing with each other. So we know that various Gnostics were like, you don't really know. No, you don't really know. So we know that they were like, my dad knows better than your dad.
Right.
So we know that already early on they were already having disagreements about what authentic Gnosis was. So that's shouldn't be terribly surprising to anyone who knows anything about the history of Christianity.
Yeah. I wonder if it have any influence on the anti-Semitism that was just prevalent for centuries and centuries and centuries in Europe. Um, I wonder if that has something to, I mean, maybe not, maybe just a little bit, maybe, I don't know. But Christianity seems to have played a role in that, I think. I don't know what you think about that.
No, for sure. I mean, there's a terrifying section in the Gospel of Matthew that this time of the year is particularly worrying for any Jew who knows their history. So they're coming up on Easter, which would have been the Passion Plays, and in the Passion Plays, there's that horrifying moment where Pontius Pilate wants to set Barabbas free, and then they trade him for Jesus, and the crowd horrifyingly says, "Let his blood be upon our hands and the hands of our children." And you're like, there it is. And we can see a clear tick through history where those passion plays would reiterate that line, where the Jews are given historical corporate responsibility for the execution of Jesus, and those passion plays sparked real violence. Now, I think that that's a medieval phenomenon. I think that this gets into Elaine Pagel's theory, right? That the development of the concept of Satan and things in the New Testament has a lot to do with their encounter with the local Jewish authorities. I'm a bit skeptical of that. I have a I don't know. I obviously have a great deal of respect for Dr. Pagels. She's an amazing scholar. But I don't read that as straightforward as she does. I think there was a bigger, much more dynamic field of dualisms that was going on at the time. But I guess I don't read into the Gnostic mythology that the Israelite God is somehow evil as a um, as an anti-Semitic idea, because I don't think anti-Semitism had developed yet.
Okay.
I think anti-Semitism doesn't really develop until really Christianity gets state power in the fourth century, and then it's then the supersessionist theology becomes weaponized. So I think it's one thing to disagree with Judaism. For instance, Nietzsche famously disagreed with Judaism. He had a lot of bad things to say about
Well,
Judaism,
yeah.
but he had a lot of really bad things to say about anti-Semites.
Right, yeah.
So I think that it is conceivable that one could argue against Judaism as a philosophy or a theology without being an anti-Semite. And I think that the early Christians did that. I think the Gnostics could have done that. I think the Romans probably could have done that. But I think that anti-Semitism as a phenomenon is a European phenomenon about the weaponization of theology and the corporate blame upon Jews for the execution of Jesus, along with things like the blood libel and poisoning wells or whatever
Right,
rando conspiracy theory that was developed in the Middle Ages and somehow still around with QAnon.
right, yeah, it's you see that still, and that's it's one of those things that you just who kno like, it's just, like, baked in the, identity of Western people who have, like, certain mindsets, they wanna put blame on something, and then that's just one of the things they did, like, for whatever reason, I can't put my finger on it, but to go back to Plato,
Mhm.
he went to his demiurge, he talks about this demiurge, he's the first mover, he creates the world, he's perfect, he even says he can't even be jealous, like, he's so perfect, he can't even be
Right.
jealous. And then when you now to go and if you connect that with what he says in Symposium, where he talks about love, the God love is the firstborn, and he gets into this whole thing about when people love each other, the world is better. We fight for each other, but we
Right.
also help each other. I almost wonder if that is an influence on Christian theology, or as Jesus is like basically love incarnate, if you will. I don't know what you think about that.
Certainly in the Gospel of John, that's the
Yeah,
gospel of love. You'd see that less so in the synoptic gospels. Um, yeah, I wonder to what degree the early apostles would have known Plato. It just seems like it's such an arcane thing to have known for a bunch of Galilean peasants who were likely illiterate. Um, I don't know. I don't know. I have to think about that more. It's definitely the case that the Gnostic mythologies that are developing in the century after the death of Jesus, the execution of Jesus, those people certainly know Plato. They know Plato damn well. So in a hundredth of the common era when the Gospel of John was being written, are they obliquely referencing Plato? I just would be very surprised if the people writing that would even had the literary acumen to have read Plato, because even by the time that they're writing in the Koine Greek that they spoke and understood, with the exception of Luke, who has somewhat of a classical training and
yeah,
writes in a slightly more classicizing Greek. Plato's Greek is still hard to read. Classical Greek is a very different animal than Koine Greek, and Koine Greek is a whole different animal than Attic Greek. Stuff in Homer and Hesiod. So I don't know. I would my first blush is skepticism. I just can't see a bunch of Jewish dudes from the Galilee with a fisherman's education, which is equivalent to no education, um, being able to get knee deep in Plato and really understand the ins and outs of that. Although I think a century later, as Christianity is developing, the intellectual
sure.
caliber of those folks goes up orders of magnitude.
What about Paul? Do you think Paul is more? Because Paul seems like he's pretty educated.
Yeah, Paul has a significantly higher degree of education. He's conversant at least at some level with Greek philosophy. The famous incident in Athens where he argues with the Stoics and the Epicureans or whatever. The
Yeah,
what is it? The Rock of the Unknown God.
Acts 17, yeah.
Yeah, I have to. It's one of those things where how much Bible do I have memorized?
Right, right.
Depends on what time of day you get me.
Yeah,
Uh, so yeah, it's clear that Paul has some higher level degree of education. Um, but even then, Stoicism in the first century, Epicureanism first century, are still a very different animal than Plato. Plato is a tough read. Um, it's hard to say. It's so hard to say that Paul is super educated because often when I read Paul, and then I'm reading him obviously as a non-Christian, and I'm not reading him malevolently. I think Paul gets a lot of hate for some reason. I don't really get there's this weird idea that somehow there was a pure Christianity, and then
yeah,
Paul came along and like corrupted it, and
right.
um, that seems always to been a particularly weird idea that I've never understood.
Speaking of that, you know how I want to know what you think about this, because in James, James is writing about how it's you got to be a doer of works. Like it's not
Right,
just
yeah.
even the demons have
Faith without works is dead.
instead, yeah. Then he says even
Yeah,
the demons have faith,
yeah.
so who cares about that? But then Paul in Romans is like, well, faith alone will get you saved. It almost seems like there's a disagreement there. Do you think maybe that's where that comes from? People are like, well, James and the Ebionites were one kind of Christians, and then Paul, it was up in the north with all the Gentiles in Turkey. Do you think maybe that's where people get that idea from? Because that could be true, or it could be wrong. Who
I think
knows?
it's likely. I mean, I think that it's very likely. I mean, Paul never knew Jesus, and he was only converted. He was converted years after he died, and spent whatever 14 years in the Transjordan desert or whatever. So, yeah, it seems very likely to me, at least, that the that the Christianities that developed in the aftermath of Jesus's execution were probably a field of beliefs.
Right.
And I imagine that there's a reason why we get the love gospel in John, and the faith gospel and Paul, although even that's sort of weird because sometimes he's also about the transformation of the body into a kind of angelic being and stuff like that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
Paul's clearly working it out as he's building the ship at sea.
Good point.
Yeah, anyone who thinks that Paul has a worked out theology hasn't.
Yeah, you're
Is
right.
he's building it, and he seems to shelve theologies too, right? It seems like the atonement theology is a later development after the ransom theology. So it seems like Paul's really developing the ship at sea, and he's really responding to his world as he develops his theology. Um, but yeah, I think that when I read James, I read someone who's much closer to a kind of Jewish attitude of that time. And I think that the word when he thinks of the word works, I mean, for me, on my Jewish brain, here's the word avodah. Like it's a way of keeping the commandments. It's a way of maintaining one's Judaism in a cultic sense, in a ritual sense. And there's no evidence that the early Jewish Christians broke decisively with the temple. They were still hanging out there. Um, so yeah, I think that probably as soon as Christ died or was executed, you didn't get Christianity. You got a splintering off of the 50 people that knew him trying to make sense of what had just happened. And
Wow.
you probably got 50 different Christianities. And those 50 Christianities probably became 150 within 30 days.
Wow.
And it's only later until you begin to get imposition. And you see that in the New Testament, where it's very clear that basic questions like what do we do with circumcision, what do we do with food, the so-called what is the Council of Jerusalem? They're not. They don't have to be Christians, like because no one's ever done that. They
Right.
have to figure it out. And
Yeah.
so
Good
the
point.
idea that there was ever a stable set of beliefs and practices that were authentically Christian, and that everything else is somehow that that existed, that didn't ever exist.
Yeah, especially when you actually like look at what Paul's writing about in these letters. He's like talking about he's like basically telling certain people in certain churches, all right, fine. If they're gonna have meat sacrificed to idols, just don't tell them, don't ask, just eat the meal, but don't know about it. It's fine. Don't ask, don't tell. And it's like you could see how they're playing these ideas are sort of like you said, it's working itself out. They're trying to figure this thing out.
Yeah.
Circumcision, you probably should get it, but if you don't, you'll be fine.
Right, yeah,
Stuff like
if
that.
you right. Yeah, if you think it's the circumcision of the flesh will save you, then you might as well get it, but yeah, I just I've never, because I'm not Christian, I've never had to and I don't have a I'm not Christian, and also I've just never really developed. I think many people develop an antagonistic attitude toward Christianity,
Mhm.
where they just wanna read everything as bad, that Paul
Right,
was bad or that Jesus never existed or whatever. I think there's that stuff has never made much sense to me,
right.
the mythicist position and stuff. For me, it seems clear that you had a traumatic moment in the lives of many people where their leader is executed, and somehow those people had visions of him resurrected, and they had to make sense of that. And that making sense process is just the development of Christianity down to now. It's the making sense of that. And the Trinity didn't come out of whole cloth. I mean, the debates around Trinitarian economics with Athanasius and Arius and all that, they don't know what they're doing. It's not like they can go look to the Gospels and look to the sky and be like, "Oh yeah, the Father and the Son generate the Spirit, and it's The Spirit flows from the Son and the Father, and no, it doesn't. It only flows from the Father. The Filioque controversy, the 11th century or whatever. It's not like they have it sorted out. They're making it up.
Yeah.
And that's why I say that, we look at someone like Valentinus, to circle us back to Gnosticism. There's a reason why people follow, if you look at the Valentinian system of the gospel of truth, most of us would look at that and go, that's no Christianity I recognize at all.
Right.
I've never heard that. Looks like crazy gobbledygook, right? And that's certainly what Irenaeus thought it was. But he had a following. He nearly became the Bishop of Rome, which we should be clear isn't the Pope like it is now. And it was an important position in Christian world, but it wasn't, but he very nearly became the Bishop of Rome. That, in his form of Christianity, survived into like the 5th century out east.
Right.
The fact that that made sense, not just to a couple of weirdos, but to many, many people, enough people to get him high enough into the church ecclesiastical structure to almost get him to be the Bishop of Rome, tells me that when I look at that gospel of truth, I see like what strikes me as crazy gobbledygook or something. But it was just as possible for someone to look at that as to look at anything else and go, this is authentically Christianity.
Right.
So when we judge these texts like the gospel of truth or Gnosticism, and we say, oh, this one is authentically Christian, that's telling us more about us and our inherited biases through history than what actual Christians in the 2nd and 1st centuries thought about what their religion was.
Wow, that's a good point.
Because Valentinus could never have gotten that high
Right.
if people just thought he was a wacko.
Right.
Right? That, so again, the point I drive home is that that we have to take these blinders off, these biases off, because a certain kind of Christianity has survived, and then measure other kinds of Christianities based on it, because that's betrayed by the fact that Gnosticism was popular. I mean, we have multiple translations of, for instance, the Apocryphon of John into different dialects of Coptic, which means it's traveling up the Nile, and
It's
people are wanting to read it in their native dialect. And that's just, and again, this is the what's called the survival bias. The survival bias is that we tend to judge the past based on what survived to the future, to now. But just because what survived till now doesn't actually tell us totally about the past, because it just could be the case that the survival bias is stronger in Egypt because of its environment that we have these texts survive. But if we just take, if we just leave the survival bias aside for just a moment, and we just take Egypt as an example, people are wanting to read these books, not just read them, but read them in their native dialects of Coptic, which tells me that I bet they're being translated into native dialects in Gaul, other places in North Africa, Italy, etc., etc. And so that we look at these documents and think that they look like they're Gnosticism. I think that anyone in Valentinus's church, if you were to ask them, "Are you a Gnostic?" they go, "I'm a Christian."
Christian, right?
Full stop.
Yeah. And so that I'm thinking of, you're familiar with the Nicene preacher, and have you ever heard this hymn? David Litwell showed this hymn to me. I guess that it's found in the Refutation of Heresies book.
Mm-hmm.
They actually, this is where it's from because it got destroyed, or there was nobody copied it. So when you see this hymn from the Nicene preacher, what first thing comes to your mind? What do you think about this?
I think that two things come to my mind. The first thing that comes to my mind, and again, I want to be really clear about that this is I've seen this kind of stuff in passing, but this one particular section is really fascinating. I want to go back to Irenaeus and see the context. But there's two things that jump to mind. The first is that we should always know that Irenaeus is doing this, and anytime Irenaeus is putting words into the mouth of the Gnostics, sometimes he's very accurate, and many times he's trying to make them look crazy, is what he's trying to do. And so, on the one hand, is it possible that there was a Christian preacher that preached the idea that Christ appeared in various kinds of ways in various kinds of cultures? Of course, because even the Bible seems to indicate that Jesus appeared prior to his incarnation as Jesus, right? In Melchizedek or whatever, Melchizedek. And there's even in Hippolytus, a couple of centuries later, Hippolytus will make the argument that Jesus sort of appears prophetically in the works of hermeticists And even there's even a weird idea that in some of Virgil's work, Jesus is prophesied to be coming in the Aeneid and what is it, the Gregorics or the Bucolics or one of them, which is just a really weird idea that Christians thought that inside of Virgil's works, which are basically imperial propaganda, you could see,
Yeah.
prophecies about Jesus. Uh, so that's the one thing. It's not unprecedented that you would have that. Two, it's Irenaeus, so we should take Irenaeus for what he's worth. And maybe a third point I'll add is every religion, despite the fact that they like to tell a story about how they're not mixed together with other stuff, that they're pure, the truth of the matter is every religion is at some level syncretistic. And that's no more clear than in the ancient Egyptian context. And that's really clear, for instance, in the Greek magical papyri, where, you know, you're trying to get Susie Q to fall in love with you, then you'll pick any god. You'll pick all the gods. You get Jesus, Osiris, Thoth, whatever. You get any god. And so syncretism is, I think, at least in the common everyday practice of religion, the rule rather than the exception. And I know plenty of like fundamentalist Christians or conservative Muslims who like go to yoga. And from the outside, they're never going to tell you that they're syncretistic
True.
Muslims or Jews or Christians. But I'm like, you're doing Hindu religious practices, that have been extracted from their original meaning or whatever. But from the outside, from the anthropological perspective, we're like, yeah, you do yoga in the morning and Jesus at night. Like, you're a syncretist. So it would be highly unusual to me if there weren't examples of syncretism in early Christianity, where if your God is the only true God, unsurprisingly, everyone kind of worships some corrupt version of your God all over the world. And so that's would be an unsurprising uh, turn of events, I suppose.
Yeah, and to me, it's like if he did say this, because we don't know if he did or not. Like you
Sure.
said, Irenaeus. But let's, for the sake of argument, let's say he did say this. To me, that would say that he's looking at Christ as like the perfect example, the logos,
Right.
something that we should follow. And he's looking around and he's saying, okay, the Phrygians love Attis, the Egyptians love Osiris. What they're looking for is Christ. So I think that's maybe what he was trying to get at.
That's certainly Paul's point, right? It's that
Yeah,
behind all these gods, the unknown God is actually Jesus. It's just that you don't. So, yeah. And I think that that kind of theology is still pretty much around. I mean, there's still, I'll think of I'll give an example from Judaism, from Maimonides. I have Maimonides on the mind these days. I'm doing a project with some other YouTubers on Maimonides, and so he's on my mind. Maimonides on the mind. It sounds like a disease or something. But at any rate, Maimonides has no love for Christianity and Islam. He thinks they're horrible heresies of some kind. But he says at least they're worshiping the one true God.
that's a good
They
point.
mucked it up. They got this Jesus thing that's all weird, and Muhammad's a crazy person, and so they're wrong about that. But at least they're worshiping the one true God, even if it's in a distorted, wrong way. So I think that on the one hand, that impulse tells us that people like to judge other people's religion and talk about how they're wrong. But on the other hand, we don't want them to be completely wrong. We want them to be sort of wrong for the right reasons. And therefore, when they worship all these other gods, what's under the hood of that is the one true God or Jesus or what have you. I love how Hinduism deals with this, by the way. Hinduism just says that Jesus is one of the incarnations of Vishnu. And
Yeah,
so, in the same way that Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu, so is Jesus. And so the Hindus say, "Yeah, we can worship Jesus too. He's just one of the many incarnations of Vishnu." So I love that the Hindus kind of
yeah.
they just solve that real easy.
I'm not surprised because I've read not the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, which is
Mhm.
inside the Mahabharata. And one of the things he tells Arjun is when you're praying to these other gods that people pray to, they're actually praying to me. I'm receiving I hear them.
Yeah,
And it's not like he's saying he's mad that they're praying to other gods. He's totally fine with it. He's the one getting them though. He's the one hearing the prayer is what he tells Arjun. So I
right.
think that's fascinating. That is a fascinating concept.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common concept, and you even see it in early Christian missionary attempts in the New World. I mean, of course, they also think that a lot of people are just worshiping the devil, so they kill them. So there's that, which is horrifyingly
Right.
unfortunate. But there was also a very common spread, for instance, among Quakers and other more tolerant Christians, that said that the Great Spirit that the Native Americans worship was actually Christ and actually God, and they just had to kind of get their religion tooled correctly. But ultimately, it was they were still, again, they were wrong for the right reasons. So I think that it's not an uncommon. Again, it would not surprise me at all if a first century Christian was preaching a similar kind of message. Um, just because I think it makes a lot of logical sense at the end of the day.
You do a lot of work on hermeticism. What do you think happened in hermeticism? And do you think it sort of gets absolved by maybe Christianity or maybe something else? What do you think happened to it?
I think that you can esoteric your way out of existence. That's always the problem with esoteric orders. That if you keep all your secrets and you're not growing, well, you're going to disappear. And so I suspect that what ends up happening, yeah, is that um, part of the reason why Hermeticism we know about Hermeticism at all is because some early Christians felt that the Hermetic texts prefigured the message of Jesus, and in their mind, really anciently. And one of the things you have to understand about early Christianity is that one of their big problems was a PR problem. They were a new religion, and there was nothing in the late classical world, the turn of the millennium as we know it. There's nothing to make your religion more wrong than it being new. For the Roman world, the Greek world, new and religion made no sense together. Like, and even the Romans who didn't like Judaism, they thought Judaism was a weird superstition with their invisible God and you had to get circumcised, who only lived in Jerusalem or whatever. The Romans thought, yeah, these Jews are weird, but their God is ancient.
Right.
And so we got to respect them. And they did to varying degrees. The Christians didn't have that because Jesus got executed like 3 days ago on a Friday. And the Romans were like, your God is recent and that's not going to work. So the Christians had a PR problem, and the PR problem could be solved by Christians attempting to show that their religion was not new, that it was in fact anchored in very, very ancient texts, of one of which was the text that we now recognize as the Corpus Hermetica, the Hermetic text. And not all Christians agree with that, by the way. Hippolytus, for instance, is very pro that, and Augustine is very anti that.
Right.
Augustine hates that stuff. And so that's the reason why, by the way, that Hermetic texts don't hardly survive in Latin. Only one of them does. And they only survive in Greek in the East. Because in the Latin world, they really follow Augustine and they don't like Hermeticism. In the Eastern world, they're a lot more amenable to Hermetic documents. Pruned, of course, to not to offend Christians. Now, why did it disappear? I think that it probably disappeared because I suspect they just became Christians. I think that there's enough overlap between Hermetic thinking and Christian thinking that at the end of the day, Christianity, as it achieved hegemony in Egypt, in the brief period that it achieved hegemony in Egypt before the rise of Islam, I just think that there was a lot of cultural pressure to convert. There's a lot of economic pressure to convert, I'm sure. And also, the Christians got downright frightening as you get into the fifth and sixth centuries. The mob that killed Hypatia in this very terrifying way. Um, so I think that there's just a lot of pressure to convert, and I think a lot of these Gnostic and otherwise groups, the ones that were sort of the hardliners, they esotericized themselves out of a job because if only you and your initiate buddies can be part of it, you're eventually going to just not have anyone part of your club anymore.
Oh wow, that's a good point.
I mean, that's a numbers game, right? If you're not actively reaching people every day, your group is shrinking just through attrition. And if part of how your group works is through elaborate initiations that take forever, well, there's just a numbers game. Your numbers are gonna fall off eventually, and you're gonna go extinct. You can ask the Freemasons how that's going for them right now, unfortunately. And I really like Freemasonry, but they're having a real time getting new members, and it has to do, I think, with those kinds of problems. So I think that some of them converted, a lot of them converted. I don't think they were ever that big to begin with, frankly. Um, and I think that the ones that didn't convert, they just esotericized themselves out of a job. So that's my general thinking. But you know, if I if I were to think about how many people these texts represent, I think never more than in the thousands, because you're talking about a highly literary movement that requires a significant degree of education. 1% of the population, 2%, 4%, 5% at the most is literate. So you do the math. It ain't going to come out much in the wash. Christianity just doesn't need literacy.
Yeah.
You know, you get baptized in, you're initiated. You don't need to read these texts and understand all this stuff and understand all these syzygies and all this. It puts an onus on the believer, it puts an onus on the adherent that I think just isn't commiserate with the material, educational, cultural conditions on the ground in the late classical world.
When we get towards like this alchemy era, are these people calling themselves hermeticists? Because I know there's a connection between the two.
They're probably not calling themselves hermeticists. In fact, the first person to call themselves a hermeticist actually doesn't even appear into the 15th century, which is,
Oh, I know that.
yeah, no one ever calls themselves hermetikoi or something like that. No one ever calls themselves that. Now that not they sometimes will call themselves followers of the way of Hermes. So we
Mm,
do see people identifying that way.
okay.
But yeah, the first person to call themselves a hermeticist, so far as we can tell, is Ludovico Lazzarelli in the 15th century. Um, but yeah, there's clearly a link between Hermes and Thoth, right? The union of those gods pretty early on in the syncretistic world of Alexandria, and particularly how alchemy goes from being a Greek theoretical thing over here, and then there's the practical metallurgical side happening adjacent to the temples of life, the Egyptian temples that are producing all those beautiful metal objects we've all seen in museums. That requires a high level of technical skill to generate metal like that,
Yeah.
to purify gold, to tint all those metals. Uh, and so what ends up happening is that in the Alexandrian context, the Greek theoretical mind and the practical Egyptian metallurgical mind meet. And they meet in examples of people like Zosimos of Panopolis or Cleopatra of Alexandria or Maria the Jewess. And it's in that crucible, to, to use a bad metaphor, it's in that crucible that alchemy emerges and becomes associated with Thoth Hermes, and that association never really goes away. It persists into the Islamic world and all the way into contemporary alchemical belief.
And so how does the name Mercury become the same as the metal, which happens to be the most important metal in alchemy, but also the god who is the hermetic god?
Yeah, it's not an accident, that's for sure. So yeah, it's Mercury has always attracted a lot of attention, and it's also just important in the process of doing chemical procedures on other metals. Um, and so yeah, I think it's just that you get this trifecta of Mercury and Hermes and the actual metal, and one of the main things that is very striking. I'm sure everyone here who's ever played with any mercury, not that you should play with mercury, is that of course it's the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, and there's something very weird about that. That it's a metal that it can attack other metals, right? Other metals can be dissolved into it. It seems to hide inside of solid things, so it's a liquid that hides inside of the solid, and it's a liquid that can become solid through other kinds of chemical procedures. So not for no reason did the early alchemists really think that mercury was the key, because it seems to be kind of protean in its nature. It seems to be liquid and solid at the same time. It seems to be a metal and a liquid at the same time. It seems to be the substratum from which all other metals emerge, because you can literally dissolve some metals into it. And so it's unsurprising that the link between the god, the metal, and the practice itself would all get united into one kind of metonymy. Um, which is interesting. If you ever get the chance, I've done a little practical alchemy myself, not in the sense of trying to turn lead to gold. I wish I could do that. Um, but for instance, extracting mercury from cinnabar, it is a really, if you have a chance to do it in a lab, which is
Right.
how they would have been done in the ancient world, it is really miraculous that you see a powder, pulverized cinnabar being heated, and then out of the steam comes liquid metal.
Wow.
And if you see it in real life, and of course, the way they did it in the ancient world was that they would have a clay alembic. They would heat that pulverized cinnabar, and then the retort would come down into a cold water bath. And as the vapor hit the water, the mercury drops would fall to the bottom as liquid metal, and the sulfur dioxide, is that right? Or mercurial oxide, it would precipitate into the water, and that water would become a very weak form of sulfuric acid. And if you distilled that water off again, it became vitriol, sulfuric acid, which was highly, highly caustic.
It sounds like a death and rebirth
Mhm.
and acting out and within an alchemy practice, which is isn't that, if I'm not mistaken, isn't there something along those lines in the initiation and the hermeticism? Some sort
Yeah,
of rebirth thing?
I'm not so sure about the death rebirth thing in Hermeticism. It certainly occurs in Freemasonry and other kinds of initiatory societies. We certainly saw it maybe in the cult of Eleusis and other mystery cults like
Right.
that. I think that it's less a thing in Hermeticism, but it becomes a huge symbolic thing in later alchemical traditions. That death and rebirth are the same thing, and we get the image of the famous Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its own tail,
Wow.
the tail-eating snake. And so the alchemist certainly had a vision of the world in which, um, because everything was one, hentopan, right? Because everything is one, everything can be dissolved back into that one, and from that one, anything can be created. And the idea, of course, is that you could take a base metal like lead, you could dissolve it back into its constituent parts, and by art, right, as opposed to by nature, one could reconfigure um, that dissolved structure into another kind of compound. Obviously gold and silver if you're smart.
It's like a
Um,
metamorphosis.
oh, it's definitely metamorphosis. But again, it has everything to do with the practical knowledge gained by the Egyptian metallurgical priests being wed with the technical theoretical knowledge of the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers and Aristotelian philosophy, and they come together in Alexandria, and that's where we get the birth of alchemy. It's really an amazing wedding.
Wow.
Um,
That is fascinating. That's like where science begins right there.
I would say so. I mean, in at least in the sense of experimental science, because we should never forget that the alchemists were experimental scientists. I think we often have the image of them as like randomly mixing stuff together, like put in a toad and here's some sulfuric acid and let's see what happens and conjure the devil and maybe we'll get gold. This is sort of the stereotypical 19th century where the alchemist and the conjurer or the necromancer are conflated. But every document we have from alchemical history shows them to be very careful experimental scientists. Now, their underlying fundamental theory of physical reality and physical change was wrong. I mean, we have to admit that. There's just no way to transmute a base metal into gold without a particle accelerator. You need a particle collider to do that. One can do it. You'll get gold that is highly radioactive. That would kill you within moments of you getting near to it, or you get radiation poisoning, and it would decompose rapidly back into a radioactive isotope. And also, the amount of energy to make that amount of gold pales in comparison to the amount of gold you would end up getting, which would again be highly radioactive and decay back within a few minutes back into mercury or lead.
So do you think the particle collider that's in Europe, or I think there's one in New York too, but I know the big one at CERN,
CERN, yeah, I've been there.
like the final evolution of like what started in Alexandria, maybe?
I'd say so. Yeah, I think that the alchemists are trying to probe using the tools they had, which by the way they developed: distillation, calcination, sublimation. Many of the laboratory equipment you would see in an alchemist lab, all the way back from ancient Alexandria, all the way through the Middle Ages and the Islamic period, you still see in labs now. They invented that stuff. If you've ever enjoyed a glass of whiskey, um, well, thank an alchemist because they invented distillation. So they were figuring this stuff out all early on and doing the experimental work to figure it out. And I think that the impulse to probe into the fundamental workings of reality, or at least physical reality, using technology, absolutely began as an experimental science back in Alexandria, and certainly when at CERN, they're still probing using the tools they have there. I will say, having been there, it is just breathtaking to see an experiment, underground between two countries that's 4 stories tall. It will take your breath away.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and yeah, this is I can ask you so many questions, but we should definitely do this again. We definitely got to do this again.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add on to what we said that to tie things up, or do you have anything you want to any books coming out, or want to talk about anything like that?
I would say that if folks are interested in this sort of stuff, alchemy, magic, Gnosticism, hermeticism, the occult, both in the ancient world, but also in the medieval world, and even into the modern world, that's sort of my wheelhouse. That's what Esoterica does. So for folks who haven't checked out Esoterica, maybe come check us out over at our channel on YouTube. And yeah, we approach things scholarly. It's an academic approach. We don't. You're not going to get a bunch of crazy. That's not true. You will get crazy weirdo stuff, but it will be academic crazy weirdo stuff.
Exactly.
But yeah, I'd love to have folks come over and check it out, and just really want to thank you for the work that you do of
Thank
facilitating really great scholars and asking really probing, fascinating questions, and facilitating the process of us all learning together. And I
Right.
got to tell you, Neil, that's a great thing. So I really want to express my appreciation for the work that you do.
Thank you, and right back at you. And anyone who's thinking about it, that is one of the best channels, maybe arguably the best. It is just priceless spot for information and knowledge. I've been subscribed for a while, so you should too. And like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.